afraid. So you all get a round of applause for surviving this far. Your heads must be reeling now. So I said I invoked Ignatius Loyola yesterday and said about the need for repetition. So fortunately, most of what I'm going to say has already been said by the other speakers. So there were a few dicey moments this morning with Joe's presentation. I thought, oh no, she's going to use exactly the same quotes that I'm going to use this afternoon. She did use two of the same pictures. This is one of them, in fact, that the more astute of you. So it's like those competitions in the newspaper, you know, spot the difference. See? So I'm going to recapitulate. This is really the last talk of the wonderful conference. So I'm going to recapitulate some of the themes and perhaps try and bring some of the material together. And in a way, my title covers yesterday, all our wonderful material on mindfulness, and today, the Carmelite tradition. So this was all cleverly planned months ago. If you believe that, you believe anything. So what am I trying to do? Well, really, in a nutshell, and those of you watching at home can switch off now and have a cup of tea or something. In a nutshell, what I'm going to do is argue that the material we looked at yesterday, the mindfulness tradition that we have today, you can find well within the Christian tradition, and particularly in the Carmelite tradition. Again, as you've heard so many times over the weekend, this is sort of bread and butter. This is meat and drink to the Carmelites. The Carmelites live and breathe it. And sometimes it's a bit like the fish in the water. I think the Carmelites are so surrounded by the prayer and the silence that they don't realize what they're in. It's only us outsiders coming to Carmel. Last night, I live in South London, so last night it was so quiet. I thought, oh my word, it's unbelievably quiet here. And it's just wonderful that first 24 hours when you come into a Carmel. And those of you who've never, on the television, who've never been to a Carmel, I recommend you just go there for a few days just to experience the silence. But before we start, Scripture is the name of the game. We're engaging in Scripture. I have to apologize at the beginning, I'm no Margaret Barker, I'm no Scripture scholar, so you're not going to get that fine parsing. In fact, I have a dear colleague, some of you may have met him, and he says, oh, my sacred Scripture is written in Spanish and German. And he says that Hebrew and Greek stuff, that's good as well, but the real sacred Scripture is Teresa of Avila and Edith Stein and so forth. Well, I'm a bit of that school. But this Scripture is good as well. I like this. This is very good. So this is Paul's letter to the Romans. And I did my own rather weak translation, and then I got my Scripture. It's a bit like the Vatican. I then got the Scripture scholars to vet it. And they said, yeah, you can get away with that, Peter. And I think this is really, again, the source of what I'm talking about this afternoon. So St. Paul writes, the Spirit participates in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we should. But that very Spirit supplicates on our behalf with unutterable groanings. And the Father, who searches the heart, knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to God. We know that in all things God works for good for those who love God, and they are called according to God's purpose. And for those whom he knew long ago, he also destined that they be conformed to the icon of the Son, so that he would be the firstborn of a large family. And the reason I share that with you, in a way, we've talked this weekend, what is the nature of Christian prayer? And if anyone asks me that question, I really point to that passage, because I think St. Paul, in a very mysterious way, actually, the more you engage with that scripture passage, the more extraordinary it becomes. He shows us a vision of the Trinitarian nature of Christian prayer. Now, I meant to do this before the lecture, so apologies for this, but I'm going to come over here. Excuse me, madam. This is all singing, all dancing production. And my next slide is that. But I noticed there's one, here's one I prepared earlier. And what we can do, because again, by the way, my students, oh dear, that's not going to work, is it? Anyway, my students at St. Mary's, they're all, there we go. Oh, wonderful. Oh, well done. You're a genius. Thank you so much. My students at St. Mary's, they're all 18 to 20-year-olds. And if I don't do a PowerPoint, they don't think it's a lecture, basically. They're not capable of taking notes. So I've got into the habit of using these PowerPoints. I don't really, because I don't think like a machine, you see. I don't think like a computer. So really, you're going to get two for the price of one, because there's this, the PowerPoint, which will go off in its own way, and then there's me and what's happening here. And sometimes they meet, and sometimes they go in opposite directions. But we get there in the end, so you'll get two for the price of one. But here you've got two for the price of one. So if you get fed up with what I'm saying in the next half hour or so, just look at this, because again, this, the famous icon by Rublev, in a way, it contains everything that we just heard. And again, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It depicts in a very beautiful way that moment in the book of Genesis. Those who are following, we heard earlier this morning from Jean about the importance of following the breviary of readings, the Missal. And those of you who have been following it the last few weeks, we have had the encounter of Abraham with the three angels at the hottest part of the day in Israel. And at that point, the three angels appear to him, and he offers them hospitality. And the icon writer, Rublev, uses this as a symbol or a foreshadow, a picture of the Trinity. So the three figures represent the three persons of the Trinity, exactly as we heard in Paul's account. But again, the more astute will notice that the table, again, it's symbolic of the Eucharist. The fourth place is empty. And that's because it's for us. So we are being invited in. In fact, if you follow the gaze of the three persons of the Trinity, they're all looking at this fourth place. And in fact, I'm sure many of you use this icon for your own prayer. It's a very powerful icon to pray in front of, because the figures do, the more you contemplate it, they do seem to penetrate into your soul. Gerald Manley Hopkins, native of Oxford, who knew this place very well. He used to walk around here. He knew this hill. He probably knew these trees very well. But Hopkins said a very lovely thing. He said, the harder you look at something, the harder it looks at you. And that is very much the case with all icons, but particularly this one. And then one more thing before we launch off. This is just the preamble. A lovely word from John of the Cross. And I toyed with two titles for this talk. The other title I toyed with was Carmelite Prayer, a dance with silence, because silence is where Carmelite prayer comes from and where it will return to. And John wrote, St. John of the Cross, the Father spoke one word, which was his Son. And this word he always speaks in eternal silence, and in silence it must be heard by the soul. And again, as Joe said this morning, in a way I don't need to give the lecture, because this, what you've got there, what John condenses there, and in a way that is a condensation of the passage we had from Paul, is again this Trinitarian notion of Christian prayer coming from the abyss. He calls it the abyss of silence. The abyss of silence that is the Father, and then coming into our souls, and then we're being taken back in. So that's what we're aiming to do. So looking at what we understand by this term Christian mindfulness, Looking again at the Carmelite tradition, again, Sister Jo did a lot of that already this morning, and the dance was silent. And then our old friend, Teresa of Avila. No talk by Peter Tyler is possible without mentioning Teresa. It's in the rules. So we'll end up with a session on Teresa. And again, you've heard a lot of this already from the other speakers. The fact that Teresa, in a way, I call her a master of prayer, and she is a master of prayer. We've heard a lot. Some of you will be sick of the word mindfulness now, almost as sick as the word Brexit. But anyway, a lot of you will be fed up with the word mindfulness by the end of this weekend. But I'm going to give you one more blast of it before we move on to the Carmelites. I gave a wonderful retreat for the Carmelite Sisters conference, the Enclosed Carmelite Sisters in Ireland a few years ago. Some of you may be listening, I don't know. And we had a ball. We had a great time, and we were in this prayer centre in Ireland called the Emmaus Centre. And before the presentation, I went and took a few photographs of the notice boards. This is a Christian Catholic retreat centre, so you can do your yoga there. You've got Tai Chi on offer. You can do solstice dancing to the rhythm of the seasons. And you've got mindful eating. So, whether you like it or not, this stuff is here to stay. We are in the mindfulness revolution, whether you like it or not. That's my allotment, to calm you down a bit after all those things. And I suppose we have to ask, hopefully one thing that you're taking away from this weekend is, how do I engage with the world we're living in? Again, Sister Jo said the post-modern, post-Brexit, whatever world is. The famous theologian Karl Barth very famously said that the Christian today has to have in his hands two things: the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And I think he was right in that respect, that we can close our eyes to what's happening, but I don't think as Christians that is part of our journey, really. The famous, we've got a few Canadians here, the famous French-Canadian Jean Vanier, who died not long ago, started the L'Arche communities, which I lived in for some years. And Vanier wrote a lovely letter to a friend of mine, lives near here actually, in Oxford. And this was a time before L'Arche, when Vanier was having problems with the church authorities, as a lot of people were before the Second Vatican Council. And he wrote this beautiful letter, and he said, from the beginning of the church, it's been God's will to raise two groups within the church. One group has to preserve the original inspiration of the gospel and carry it from one generation to the other. And he said the other group has to adapt the gospel to each generation. And he said it's God's infinite will and wisdom that both groups will make life hell for each other. So you've got that tension within the church. You've got that tension within theology between preserving, holding on to what's the true voice of the gospel, but also making it available for each generation. And I think that's really what I'm trying to do today, is trying to say, how can we make this Carmelite tradition that we've heard so much about this weekend be in dialogue with where we are today? And again, like other speakers, when I thought about how to answer that question, I then said to myself, well, what is Carmel? What is this Carmelite spirituality? And as Jo pointed out, we have a problem. No one knows how it started. No one knows where it started. And as you heard so well this morning, succeeding generations, that was a problem. There was no Francis, there was no Dominic, there was no Ignatius. So there was a bit of a void. Now, some people don't like that, especially British people. They don't like mysteries, something you've got to tidy up. I quite like it. I mean, I quite like the fact that we don't know who started the Carmelites. And indeed, it's true. Roddy talked yesterday about the mystical tradition. A lot of the key figures in the mystical tradition we know nothing about. Dionysius the Areopagite, Richard of St. Victor, Eriugena, all these people we know very little. All we know is a name. I love that. I think that's wonderful, that we don't know. The second thing, and this is, of course, is Mount Carmel as it stands today. It's always been of strategic importance. We heard this morning how important it was for the Crusaders. This is the Carmelite monastery of Stella Maris. Anyone been there? Hands up. And a few at home, I can see your hands up. Yeah. So it's a wonderful place, and I really do recommend it. And they do need the visitors. So, if you are planning your holidays, I do recommend a visit there. Today, the Israelis own, they have a missile listening station here. They'd like to take it over, but the Carmelites have stopped them taking over. And when there was a little war recently between Lebanon and Israel, the first missiles landed in the vegetable garden of the Carmel. So it's still right on the front line. And it's on a fault line. I don't know if there's anyone listening from San Francisco. I was in San Francisco a few weeks ago. But San Francisco, as we know in the last news reports, is on a fault line. And Carmel sits on a fault line. And we heard about that this morning. The fault line that's called the Crusades. And again, when it was discussed this morning, immediately it starts people off, because these are very, very, very important things. And in psychological terms, we're talking about the shadow. And the shadow is always a dangerous thing. But of course, Jung said the shadow is 90% pure gold as well. And Carmel arises on that fault line. The first time that the Christian culture, European Christian culture, has really engaged with a non-Christian culture of equal power and significance, the Muslim culture. And of course, we know the results, this sort of cataclysmic result, these terrible things that were done. But the fault line still exists. You saw that this morning. It's a tripwire. And it's a tripwire in the psyche, really. So Carmel is extraordinary in a way, because it is on the borderline of two worlds, if not three worlds. Carmel itself is sacred to the three Abrahamic faiths. In the Jewish tradition, in the Song of Songs, we hear, "Your head crowns you like Carmel, and your flowing locks are like purple." And again, we heard earlier today, very well from Sister Jo, about the importance of Carmel in the Book of Kings and the stories of Elijah. When I was at Carmel, just showed you one of my holiday snaps. When I was at Carmel a few years ago, I went to the place where where Elijah fought with the prophets of Baal. You remember that incident? And now it's where the young Israelis go for their barbecue. So it was very, very atmospheric, all this burning meat everywhere. It was very evocative. So for the Jews, Carmel is sacred. For the Muslims, it's sacred. Now, we heard an interesting little footnote. I always like to listen to the little footnotes that Joe put in about during the sort of fag end of the Crusades, that possibility of the Christians hanging out in Carmel as a safe refuge. And what's interesting is that Carmel is sacred to the mystical branch of Islam. And in the mystical branch of Islam, Elijah is known as Khidir, the green one, we'd call him in English. And Khidir is the one who brings life, who brings verdancy. He's the one, in a way, who removes blocks. He's the one when you're having a hard time, he will come and help you. And I've got an very lovely old book at home with pictures of Carmel and the Holy Land from the beginning of the 20th century and into modern times. The Sufi fraternities would gather on Mount Carmel on the feast day of Elijah, and they would join with the friars at Stella Maris to celebrate Elijah. So this is in modern times that this still happened. I'm sure it doesn't happen now. It might happen now, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't. And near the mountain I just showed you, there is a famous little cave, which is traditionally called the Cave of the Prophets. You can still go and visit it today. Today it is a synagogue, but in its history it's been a mosque, and it's been a Christian church. And apparently even before the Abrahamic faith it was a Roman temple. So a very, very interesting fault line that Carmel lies upon. The era as well, the beginning of the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, it's a time of transition. In a way, we wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for that time of transition, because it's the time when Oxford University and most of the European universities were founded. It's the beginning of the professional intellectuals, you know, people like me, people who earn their living by giving lectures. And in a way, that's a good thing, because it pays my mortgage, and I'm very grateful to the university. But on the other hand, it's a sad thing, because we have had, as a theme this weekend, the notion of an academic conference and a pastoral conference. And some of the speakers have been a bit flummoxed by that. Some have been apologetic. Some said, oh, I'm not academic enough, or I'm not pastoral enough. And that's rather sad, really, that we feel that, you know, either you're an academic or you're a pastoral person. That did not exist before the 12th century. And unfortunately, for all the goods that come from the rise of the universities, you do have a split in Western theology. If you look at the theologians, the fathers and mothers we were talking about earlier on, if you look at the early fathers and mothers, that split is not there. And I think what we see today in places like here at Boars Hill and other spirituality centres, Avila in Dublin is another example, is an attempt to go back to that place, attempt to go back to that place of unity where the mind and the heart weren't in two separate places, with, as we heard yesterday, the catastrophic effects. So this strange little group of people hanging around on Mount Carmel, and as we heard so well this morning, Albert of Vercelli, blessed Albert, comes and gives them the rule. This is a photograph of the exact moment he's giving the rule to the first comers. But notice the cloaks. Now, this is again a photograph that we had this one yesterday. This is actually the scene before the one we saw with Joe this morning. This is from, I think it's the Pinacoteca in Siena, next to Siena Cathedral. And it's one of the few artists who does this. He's painting the original robe of the Carmelites. Now, if you look carefully at our brothers on the back row there, chatting away, if you look carefully at them, you'll see that they're not really wearing. I don't think you, have you ever worn anything like that? No, only in a pantomime, perhaps. And this is significant. Now, it may seem a trivial detail, but this is the original robe of the Carmelites. And it gives us a clue. Again, we heard about it from Joe this morning, but this is a visual representation of the otherness of Carmel. Once the Carmelites, as we heard this morning, were kicked out of Mount Carmel with the Crusades and so on and so forth, and they had to find their way. And by the way, the Carmelites were always a seafaring order. The first foundations were in seaports, and the great devotion to Our Lady Stella Maris, Star of the Sea. It's no coincidence, because the Carmelites are a restless order, really. They're always on the sea of life. And when they came, this lot pitched up in Kent. I mean, today is quite a nice day here, but this is our visitors from overseas, I think, are lulled into a false sense of security to think that England's always like this. But imagine these people pitching up in a cold November night in Kent, and people just didn't know what had hit them. You know, who are these people? What's that they're wearing? It looks like an old rug they're wearing, and what's this stripes? The stripes represent the sparks from Elijah's chariot as it goes up to heaven, the sparks coming down and burning their vestments. And over time, what we see, and this is a 16th century Spanish painting from Toledo, what do we see is that they begin to conform. So they change their rule from that very austere rule we heard about earlier to something that's more like the Franciscans and Dominicans. Because in the West, the church authorities are saying, well, we know what Franciscans do, we know what Dominicans do, but what the hell do you lot do? So what you see our brothers wearing today is a sort of westernized habit. It's the sort of habit that would not go, you could walk down the street without too much attention. And as we heard, and again, Joe's already given you the lecture on this, so I don't need to go through all this. But what happens then is, of course, Mary is made an honorary Carmelite, so she gets put in her Carmelite robe. Elijah becomes a Carmelite. He gets a nice new Carmelite robe. And this lot, they lose their stripy ones. So it's what we call revisionism, you know. Which is fine. This is fine, you know. You've got a brand, you know. Branding is very important with these things. And one last little picture. This is, in a way, where they end up. This is one of the Carmelite intellectuals. He's at the other place, which I can't name. It begins with C and ends with E, and it's somewhere in the east of England. It's another university, I understand. I've never been there. But in Oxford and Cambridge, there are Carmelite intellectuals, and this is one of them here. And as we heard about people like Baconthorpe, Soreth, Netter, these are towering intellectuals. So the journey, which you've heard so much of this weekend, so I don't need to repeat, the journey is a long one and a complicated one. And if you like, the myth of foundation of the Carmelite order is quite multi-layered. It's a rather long quote, but I do like this quote. And this is from Kees Wajman, who is from the Low Countries, a very eminent Carmelite scholar. And I'll read this slowly. The rule of Carmel thus embodies three religious concepts. The eremitic way of life. So that's what Joe talked about earlier. This is the way of life of the fathers and mothers of the desert. The cenobitic form of life. This is the life in community. And the life as a mendicant, as a beggar, like the Dominicans and Franciscans. The combination of these three concepts is not the product of careful thought, but of life lived within a single century, from hermit to cenobite to mendicant. The tensions between these three types of religious life have internally led to conflicts down to this day. But they have also forced the Carmelites to go below the surface, to a deeper level, to look for the mystical space of contemplation, a level from the perspective of which all forms and concepts are relative. I think it's a wonderful quote, and he really, for me, encapsulates this mystery of Carmel, this essence of Carmel, this contradiction in terms. It's a contradiction and a unity, a trinity in a way, of these three forms of life, always struggling for existence. And of course, when we hear of Teresa and her reforms and John and her reforms, it's just another part of the story. It's a part of the Carmelite toing and froing, this Carmelite discussion going on within the family. Now, from our point of view, again, I don't need to say much about this because we heard about it this morning. What is important is that the rule, therefore, holds the shadow or the negative or the photograph of the desert. You can smell the desert in the rule of Carmel. You can smell the flowers on Mount Carmel, you know, when you read it. And there's a sort of nostalgia for Carmel. It runs like a golden thread throughout the history of Carmel, a nostalgia for this lost Eden. You know, they only had it for a few decades and then it was snatched from them. And there's a sort of longing. You hear it so much in John of the Cross, you know, the ascent of Mount Carmel. It's a mystical ascent. And the rule that concerns us today is that the chapter is the one on silence, which we heard again this morning. Let each remain in his cell or near it, meditating day and night on the word of the Lord, and keeping vigil in prayer unless he is occupied with other lawful activities. This is the sound of the desert. This is the sound of the desert wind. And again, some of you, I'm sure, have spent time in the desert. And it's a wonderful place. It's where, in a way, Christian spirituality arises. Time for a quick plug now. I'm only allowed out if I can advertise. We're starting, I teach on an MA in Christian spirituality at St. Mary's, where I work. And whenever in a few weeks' time, I'll be starting the beginning of the course. And I always do the first session on the desert tradition, because I don't think you can understand Christian spirituality unless you go to the desert. After his baptism in the Jordan, what does Jesus do? He goes straight into the desert. We hear in Paul's letters, after his conversion, first thing he does, he goes into the desert. So we do it every year. We enact it every year in that wonderful, beautiful time of celebration called Lent, which I'm sure you all enjoy as much as I do. You know, Lent is Easter. I always feel is a bit of an anticlimax after Lent, but Lent is this wonderful time when we can smell the desert. It comes into our lives. And this is a quote from a lovely man called John Chrysavgis, who works for the Ecumenical Orthodox Patriarch. And this is how he describes silence. Silence is a way of waiting, a way of watching, a way of listening. It is a way of interiority, of stopping and then of exploring the cellars of the heart and the centre of life. Silence is never merely a cessation of words. Rather, it is the pause that holds together all the words, both spoken and unspoken. Silence is the glue that connects our attitudes and actions. It is fullness, not emptiness. It is not an absence, but the awareness of a presence. By the way, I'm going to leave these PowerPoints with fathers here. If you'd like a copy, and I'll leave my email at the end. If you want a copy, just there for you. You know, you can have these. Saves paper rather than printing them out. And here's a quote from one of the Desert Fathers himself, Abba Poemen. A person may seem to be silent, but if their heart is condemning others, they are babbling ceaselessly. But there may be another who talks from morning till night, and yet they are truly silent. That is, they say nothing that is not profitable. You know, there's a sort of silence. If when I go to my church on Sunday morning before the mass begins, everyone's this really noisy silence. It's the noisiest silence. Everyone's waiting for the priest to come in, and then they can start singing. You know, there's a sort of silence that's very noisy. Yeah, but what we're talking about here is a silence of the heart. By the way, could we just have that door open, because I'm getting quite excited. So. The desert heat. Thank you. So, on to our calendar girl, Teresa. And again, a lot of the intervening story has been said already in this conference, so I don't need to talk too much about it. But just, in a way, everything that comes from Teresa, I think, arises, if it doesn't arise from her study of the documents, many of which weren't available, it certainly arises from her heart and her understanding of what she really got, this notion, this dance of silence that lies at the heart of Carmelite prayer, the famous walls of Avila. And we heard already this morning, Jean put it very beautifully about a book that we call The Way of Perfection, and how in that book you buy that book and think, okay, well, this is a book on prayer. Half the book, as Jean points out, is not about prayer. Half of the book is about how we live an ethical life of virtue. And exactly as he said this morning, that is essential for Teresa. You can't embark on the contemplative life until you've got that bit in place. If you've not got those foundations, she says, it's not worth bothering. So when she finally gets, this is chapter 19, this is the Valladolid version we heard about this morning. Chapter 19, she writes, there are some souls and some intellects,
as unruly as horses, not yet broken in. No one can stop them. Now they go this way, now they go that way. They're never still.
I think she's right talking about herself some of this time, yeah.
Some people are either like this by nature or God permits them to become so. I'm very sorry for them. They seem to me like people who are very thirsty and see water a long way off, yet when they try to go to it, find someone who all the time is barring their path, at the beginning of their journey, in the middle, and at the end.
And as we heard again so well this morning, I think it is autobiographical. It didn't come easy to her. You know, she'd had a hard time, and the whole journey in prayer was for her one that, you know, had to be done incrementally, and she realized her weakness and how she relied on the grace of God. One of her last and greatest books, The Interior Castle, she puts it even more wonderfully. And again, those of you who do prayer, for example, in the chapel just now, earlier on, you sit down and then these voices start coming, don't they? These sort of little, the Desert Fathers call them wordlets, little words, logismoi coming in. So she says, we shall always be glancing around and saying, are people looking at me or not? If I take a certain path, shall I come to any harm? Dare I begin such and such a task? Is it pride that is impelling me to do this? Can anyone as wretched as I engage in so lofty an exercise as prayer? Will people think better of me if I refrain from following the crowd? Extremes are not good, they say, even in virtue. I'm such a sinner that if I were to fail, I should only have further to fall. Perhaps I shall make no progress. In that case, I shall only be doing good people harm. Anyway, a people like myself has no need to make herself singular. And so it goes on. Now, we could call this the ego, yeah? This is the ego, the chattering away. She called it earlier the wild horse. The Buddhists call it the monkey mind. You know, any of you have seen wild monkeys, always around, busy. So the mind is chattering away. And she goes on to say, O souls who are not able to have much discourse of the understanding or hold your thoughts upon God without being distracted, get used to it. Get used to it. And she says, O Lord, all our trouble comes to us from not having our eyes fixed upon thee. If we only looked at the way along which we are walking, we should soon arrive. But we stumble and fall 1,000 times and stray from the way because, as I say, we do not set our eyes on the true way. And she ends this passage with this beautiful phrase, really. Represent, make present the Lord himself joined with you, and see how lovingly and how humbly he is teaching you. And believe me, you should stay with so good a friend for as long as you can before you leave him. I'm not asking you now to think of him. She's very specific about this. It's not, see, the problem is, in the Spanish, the term is oración mental, which is normally translated into English as mental prayer. The problem with the word mental, as it's used today in English, it's a very heady cognitive concept. One of the Carmelites in Ireland said, sure, now we're not mental as Carmelites, you know. And she's not, what she's advocating here is not a cognitive exercise. I am not asking you now to think of him. And that's why now, whenever I come across the term in her writings, oración mental, I translate it with the term mindfulness. Because I think, as you heard yesterday, and it was very interesting hearing Sarah's account yesterday, in the Buddhist tradition, mindfulness has that moral dimension, which is sometimes you don't find as it's at practice today. So I, more and more now, I use mindfulness as the translation for what she's talking about here, because I think this is Christian mindfulness. That's what I call it anyway. I'm not asking you now to think of him, or to form numerous conceptions of him,
or to make long and subtle meditations with your understanding. I'm asking you only to look at him. For who can prevent you from turning the eyes of your soul just for a moment, if you can, do no more, upon this Lord? And she, again, very famously writes that for mental prayer, mindfulness is none other, it appears to me, than a close intercourse, frequently practiced on an intimate basis, a trato con Dios, with the one we know loves us. A couple of last things and then we'll finish because we're running out of time. And again, we heard this yesterday from Susan. She appends to this a few caveats or a few warnings. And this is, again, a very famous passage that she writes in The Interior Castle. When I see people very diligently trying to discover what kind of prayer they're experiencing, and so completely wrapped up in their prayers, they seem afraid to stir or indulge in a moment's thought, but they should lose the slightest degree of tenderness and devotion which they've been feeling. I realize how little they understand of the road to the attainment of union. They think that the whole thing consists of this. So again, I think Susan put this very well yesterday, this danger of getting obsessed with prayer states. You know, am I in the fourth mansion? Am I still back in the third? You know, it's like a sort of celestial snakes and ladders. I mean, if that's how you read The Interior Castle, you've completely misunderstood what she's trying to get across. And then in typical Teresa forthright fashion, no, sisters, no. What the Lord desires is works. If you see a sick woman to whom you can give some help, never be affected by the fear that your devotion will suffer, but take pity on her. If she is in pain, you should feel pain too. If necessary, fast so that she may have your food, not so much for her sake as because you know it to be your Lord's will. That is the true union with his will. So again, as we heard yesterday, that going out into the world, all prayer must lead to actions. In the, this is a beautiful icon that belongs to Julian MacLean. In the Book of the Life, she describes the journey of prayer in the famous analogy of the four waters. And as an allotment holder myself, I can appreciate this. At the beginning, she says, we have a dry, arid patch, and we have to go out with buckets and water the ground. And then slowly we develop a windlass. We develop a system of water irrigation. And then as time comes on, we discover a river. We discover a natural channel that's flowing. This is the grace of God coming in. And then, as so often happens in England, not so often in Spain, it rains. The rain comes. This is the grace of God coming down. But she says at the end of this famous passage, remember, sisters, though, the water is for the flowers, and the flowers are good works. So the aim of the prayer is not to get into some bliss. We heard yesterday about the jhanas, the Buddhist states of enlightenment. That is not the aim of prayer for Teresa. The aim of the prayer is to go out, to be doing the good works. So if we want to describe or say what is Christian mindfulness, as I said right at the beginning, it's Trinitarian in nature. That is at the heart of what it's about, and that is the goal and aim of it. It has a fixation on the other. You know, the other, God, Christ, the Spirit, is our focus. And we represent visually Christ within ourselves. The image is very important, as is the sound. Sound and image are very important parts of, we heard the liturgy earlier today. These are important parts of what Christian prayer and mindfulness is about. And finally, the good works. You know, the water is for the flowers. One last little coda, and then I really will finish. This lovely passage, again, in the Valladolid version, chapter 17. She says, I myself spent over 14 years without ever being able to meditate, except while reading. There must be many people like this, and others who cannot meditate even after reading, but can only recite vocal prayers, in which they chiefly occupy themselves and take a certain pleasure. Some find their thoughts wandering so much they cannot concentrate upon the same thing, but are always restless, to such an extent that if they try to fix their thoughts upon God, they are attacked by 1,000 foolish ideas and scruples and doubts concerning the faith. And what she's saying here is, this contemplative prayer, this oratio mental, this mindfulness, it might not be for you. And she says, don't get wound up about that, you know. We heard about Francisco de Osuna earlier in his book, wonderful book, The Third Spiritual Alphabet, which we heard so influenced Teresa. He begins it by saying there are 10,000 types of people and 10,000 types of prayer. And I think this is the key, really. We don't, so many Christians, non-Christians, are guilty about prayer. You know, we're told, oh, you should pray all the time. But a lot of people just don't know how to pray. And they always feel they're falling short of some ideal form, that there's some perfect person somewhere in Boars Hill in constant adoration. I'm sure it's the case, but I have not met that person. It might be Father Alex, but I'm not quite sure. But, you know, we've got this myth of this perfect prayer. And the reality is we start, as Teresa puts it very, very simply and humbly. Remember, humility is central. Humus, the earth. Humor, humility, humbleness. This is very important. We start with where we are, with our feet on the earth. So it's the right thing at the right time. Don't force your prayer. And this notion of Christian mindfulness is not for everyone. And the famous passages at the end of The Way of Perfection, she said, let us not try to pamper ourselves, daughter. We are quite well off here. There's only a single night for us to spend in this bad inn. And there she is on her way round Spade, going around. So thank you very much.